Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to share in Torah and to share one another's Torah with each other. We are in Parshat Behar, which is in the book of Leviticus at the very beginning of chapter 25. And if you'd like to go ahead and unmute at this point together, we can join in reciting our blessing for this moment together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. We'll go ahead and read through the English translation of our Torah portion. I'll share with you a bit of a focused study on this week's Torah portion, and then we will engage in our collaborative conversation about our reflections on this week's Torah portion. Let me share with you the opening verses, and then I'll offer everyone an opportunity, if they'd like to do so, to go ahead and read some verses as well. Adonai spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of Adonai. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of Adonai. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. Tony, would you like to read a little bit at verse 5?
You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land, but you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield.
Thank you, Tim. Anna, do you want to read a little bit of verse 8?
You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement. You shall have the horn sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth or harvest the untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat only the growth direct from the field.
Thank you. Richard, you want to read a little bit there at verse 13?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. When you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee. And in selling to you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price. For what he is selling you is a number of harvests. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for I, the Lord, am your God.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to read it a little bit?
I don't think I'm in the right place.
Okay, so Richard can help you find the right place, and let me go to Paul right now. Would you like to read at verse 18, Paul?
Thank you, Rabbi. You shall perform my decrees and observe my ordinances and perform them. Then you shall dwell securely on the land. The land will give its fruits, and you will eat your fill. You will dwell securely upon it. If you will say, what will we eat in the 7th year? Behold, we will not sow and not gather in our crops. I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, and it will yield a crop sufficient for the 3-year period. You will sow in the 8th year, but you'll eat from the old crop until the 9th year. Until the arrival of its crop, you will eat the old.
Thank you so much. Now, how would you like to read it?
Yes.
Now we're at verse 23.
But the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. I keep turning those pages. I do that. You are but strangers, resident with me throughout the land you hold. You must provide for the redemption of the land. If your brother is in straits and has to sell part of his holding, his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem for him, but prospers and acquires enough to redeem him, he shall compute the years since its sale, refund the difference to the man to whom he sold it, and return it to his holding. If he lacks sufficient means to recover it, what he sold shall remain with the purchaser until the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, it shall be released, and he shall return to its holding.
Thank you so much, Helen. And Michael, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 29?
Okay. 29. If a man shall a residence house in a, if a man shall sell a residence house in a walled city, its redemption can take place until the end of the year of its sale. Its period of redemption shall be a year. But if it is not redeemed until its full year has elapsed, then the house that is in a city that has a wall shall pass in perpetuity to the one who purchased it for his generations. It shall not go out in the Jubilee year. But houses in the open towns which have no surrounding walls shall be considered like the land's open field. It shall have redemption and shall go out in the Jubilee year. As for the cities of the Levites, the houses in the cities of their ancestral heritage, the Levites shall have an eternal right of redemption. And what one will buy from the Levites, a house that has been sold, or the city of its ancestral heritage, shall go out in the Jubilee year. For the houses of the Levite cities, that is their ancestral heritage among the children of Israel. But the fields of the open land of their cities may not be sold, for it is an eternal heritage for them.
Thank you so much, Michael. And let me invite Justin. Would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 35?
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes. If your brother becomes destitute and his hand falters beside you, you shall support him, whether a convert or a resident, so that he can live with you. You shall not take from him interest or increase, and you shall fear your God and let your brother live with you. You shall not give him your money with interest, nor shall you give your food with increase. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you to the land of Canaan, to be a God to you.
Thank you so much, Justin. And Wendy and Bill, would you like to read starting at verse 39? And you'll need to unmute.
Sorry. If your kinsman under you continues in straits and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. Then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding.
For they are my servants, whom I have freed from the land of Egypt, that they may not give themselves over to servitude. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. Such male and female slaves as you may have, as it is from the nations around you, that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also buy them from among the children of aliens resident among you, or from their families that are among you, whom they begot in your land. They shall become your property, but you may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. such you may treat as slaves, but as for your Israelite kinsmen, no man shall rule ruthlessly over the other.
Thank you both so much. Robert, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 47?
Yes, thank you. And if a sojourner or stranger wax rich by thee, if thy brother that dwelleth by him wax poor, and sell himself unto the stranger or sojourner by thee, or to the stock of the stranger's family, after that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him. Either his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or any that is nigh of kin unto him of his family may redeem him. Or if he is able, he may redeem himself. And he shall reckon with him that bought him from the year that he was sold to him unto the year of Jubilee. And the price of his sale shall be according unto the number of years, according to the time of an hired servant shall it be with him. If there be yet many years behind, according unto them, he shall give again the price of his redemption out of the money that he was bought for. And if there remain but few years unto the year of Jubilee, then he shall count with him, and according unto his years shall he give him again the price of his redemption. And as a yearly hired servant shall he be with him, and the other shall not rule, shall not rule with rigor over him in thy sight. And if he be not redeemed in these years, then he shall go out in the year of Jubilee, both he and his children with him. For unto me the children of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt, and I am the Lord your God.
Thank you so much, Robert. And Catherine, would you like to read the first two verses of chapter 26, which will bring us to the conclusion of our Torah portion?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You shall not make idols for yourselves or set up for yourselves carved images or pillars or place figured stories in your land to worship upon. For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and venerate my sanctuary, mine, the Lord's.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much, everyone. That's our Torah portion for this week. I'd like to share with you a little bit of focus study. If you have a copy of this week's study sheet, which is actually 3 pages long this time, because I have a number of bits of poetry that I've attached to our study sheet this week. I'm focusing on on the opening verses of this week's Torah portion. There are words in there that really caught my attention, and it caused me to just settle on some of these words for an extended period of time. So I'd like to share with you the words that caught my attention and what kind of associations I was able to spin off reflecting on some of these words. So number one in our study sheet this week is called Freedom and Return, because the whole notion of the Jubilee year is a kind of resetting of life when it becomes overly complicated, and we find ourselves in unsettled matters where we've either lost land or lost freedom or become indebted. And so there's this scheme, which is a rather utopian scheme of kind of bringing everything back, resetting everything back to, if you will, a baseline. So I'd like to share with you the number one, some of the verses that appear in the opening portion of Parshat Behar. Adonai spoke to Moses on the mountain. You shall count off 7 weeks of 7 years. Then you shall sound the shofar loud. You shall sanctify the 50th year. You shall call out Dror in the land for all who dwell there. It shall be a Yovel for you, and each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. So I've placed in bold type the words or phrases that really caught my attention. First, on the mountain, then the word Doror, the word Yovel, and then the notion of returning. So the phrase on the mountain kind of caught my attention, which is how the name of our Torah portion, Behar, means on the mountain. And I was kind of struck by the notion of what happens, the kind of speaking that happens on the mountain, what it means to be on the mountain. And as we get into this material, I also want to step back and look at the painting a little bit, this beautiful painting by Israeli artist Yoram Ra'anan called The Jubilee Year. And I'd like to share with you a description of it from the artist himself, and that's number 2 on our study sheet. The painting captures this idyllic time when liberty and freedom will be declared in the land. Blue strokes of paint meet with rich green and yellow hues of the verdant soil, representing heaven and earth meeting in a life that will be ideal. The Ramban says that Yovel means to transport, and that the Jubilee year will transport everyone and everything back to its source in peace, justice, and tranquility. So to return to the notion of all of this is now being spoken from on the mountain, I began to imagine other associations, other pieces of literature that speak about speaking from the mountaintop. And I'm thinking about mountaintop speech. Perhaps there's a certain kind of speech that happens from the very mountaintop. So I recall that we have this verse from the prophet Isaiah. How welcome on the mountain are the footsteps of the herald, announcing happiness, heralding good fortune, announcing victory, telling Zion, your God is king. This Isaiah here is painting this picture of a herald on the top of a mountain whose job it is to proclaim happiness, proclaiming good fortune, and announcing victory. And of course, wrapping it all up in the notion that, and God is your sovereign. What a wonderful speech to hear from a mountaintop. And maybe there is something particularly unique about speech that comes from a mountaintop that announces these kinds of good tidings. If you turn over, on the study sheet, I recalled also the classic African-American spiritual, go tell it on the mountain. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born. The sense of hope, redemption, salvation that is at hand to inspire people to work through the most strenuous, difficult of all conditions, to be enslaved, and to hear that this message is a message for them, that redemption awaits them, to have a kind of hope that will enable them to persevere and endure through these moments of constraint. Of course, that phrase, go tell it on the mountain, was also the title of a great novel written by the great African-American writer, James Baldwin, in which the main character, John, is growing up, and he confronts a lot of issues related to identity, related to family biology, and also a lot centering around religion and a kind of vision and sense of salvation that he has through his religion, which is both a source of some terror to him and also a source of great hope. And then I thought of a very famous speech that was part of American history. It was given in 1968, and it's called the Mountaintop Speech. It's a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave on April 3rd, the day before he was assassinated. And here's the setting. Dr. King came to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers. This was a matter of most material of importance to these workers. And Dr. King came in to support them and also to support them with a message of hope. And the night that the day that he arrived there, it was a terrible storm. And he had, people had gathered at a church to hear him speak. And he thought, you know, it's terrible weather. It's stormy. The winds were howling. The rain was coming down. And he didn't think that anyone would really show up for a speech. And so he sent Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young to go to the church and speak on his behalf. And when the two of them got there, the place was filled. And so they quickly realized that they really needed to and wanted to hear Dr. King speak. And so Reverend Abernathy got up and he spoke a little bit, and he sent Andrew Young back to the hotel where Dr. King was staying to bring Dr. King back. So Dr. King comes into this church, and the wind was such that the windows, as I was described, are flapping back and forth, and there's a lot of noise and the wind and the rain. And Dr. King gets up and he first goes through a summary of the struggle in the civil rights movement, and he begins to reflect on all the accomplishments and all the challenges that they've overcome. And then as he gets towards the end of his speech, he becomes a little bit more personally reflective. And he says this: "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." He gives a speech, and he's really channeling Moses, who towards the, as we'll see in our Torah portion in Deuteronomy, and Moses is there at the mountaintop, and he's looking down at the promised land, and he knows he's not going to get there. But he knows that with good leadership, the people will get there. And that's what's most important. And so this notion of being on the mountaintop is also the capacity to be able to have this perspective, to see across time, perhaps. This sense is this fusion where past, which he has talked about early in his speech, present, his own condition at this moment, and then the sense of the future where he can see ahead and he sees what will be accomplished. Past, present, and future are all fusing together at this moment on the mountaintop. It was the next day that he was shot and assassinated. So this is his last formal speech. In the beautiful novel by Anita Diamond, The Red Tent, Zilpah, when they are moving into the valley of Shem, this new land that's being offered to them by the people that live there, Zilpah looks up and sees the valley and sees the mountains, and she thinks it's beautiful, and she says, "Mountains are where heaven meets earth." Well, this notion that The mountaintop is a site of connection between the land below and the heavens above. This is a very, very compelling image. So those are some of the thoughts that came through my mind as I was thinking about just the whole notion of Behar being on the mountain. What does a mountain represent? What can happen on a mountain? What kind of speech is particularly evoked by being on a mountaintop? And then I would like to take a look at the next word I had in bold, where the verse says, "You shall call out Deror in the land for all who dwell there." And oftentimes the word Deror is represented as either freedom or liberty, or sometimes the word release. When you look at the Hebrew and the etymology of the word Deror, the root here, dalet resh resh, is a verb that means to flow abundantly. And Deror as a noun is a flowing. And interestingly enough, that same root produces the word darom, which means south. The notion that things flow in this direction flows south. And so south is the direction of flow, if you will. So what's being proclaimed here, if one wants to render the word Deror literally, is you shall call out a flowing in the land for all who dwell there. And then, of course, the key word in our Torah portion, Yovel. It shall be a Yovel for you. And it gets translated as Jubilee. And in number 5, I have the root for the word Yovel is Yoval, which means to conduct, bear along, carry away. Yoval means a watercourse or stream. Yoval means a produce of soil. Yovel is literally a ram's horn. And Tevel, it means world, comes from the same root. So what this year really is, it shall be a water course. It shall be a stream. And so what's being proclaimed is a flowing, and what this 50th year shall represent will be a time of produce and effluence and a flowingness. A lot of commentators have focused on this word Yovel to try and figure out exactly what's the nuance here, what does it mean? One of the great commentators, Ibn Ezra, says Yovel means sending away, as in sending away of slaves. And Nachmanides, Yovel means freedom, freeing of the slaves. The Ramban focuses on the literal root here and says Yovel means movement. And Rabbeinu Nechaya, who was a Spanish Kabbalist and rabbi about the year 1300, says Yovel means rivulet, as in during Yovel, everything flows back to its original source. So this is kind of the image and the feeling that's being conveyed by this notion of a Jubilee, of a Yovel, which is when things get out of sync, when people become overly burdened with debt, and in particular, when the land becomes unsettled. There is in Torah this utopian notion of when the 12 tribes settle in the promised land, each tribe was to have a certain territory within the promised land. And over time, what happens is someone in a certain tribe may become indebted, impoverished, in economic straits. And so they lend the land, they indebt themselves to someone from a different tribe. And so someone from a different tribe can have ownership or possession of land in another tribe's territory. And so it becomes all mixed up. And so this is a kind of utopian scheme where we understand the complications of daily life and how things can get out of whack, and the beauty and the perfection of what we had in mind becomes unrealized. And so every so often, every 50 years, we want things to be reset so that land goes back to the tribe that it was originally assigned to. So this notion about going back to an original scheme is kind of intriguing. And we have a lot of poetry that and spiritual insights that tell us, that teach us that when we reset things, when we go back to where things were at the beginning, they're never the same as they originally were. Something has changed. Something within us has changed. And when something within us changes, then the world changes as well. So this notion about this confluence of past, present, and future, which is what perhaps Dr. Martin Luther King was channeling, this notion about going back to something that was pure and simple, which is what our commentators are telling us is nuanced by the notion of the Jubilee of the Yuvel, was explored by the poet T.S. Eliot in his poem Little Gidding. Little Gidding is the last of 4 poems that were part of a larger piece called the 4 Quartets. And this last one is really a reflection on spirituality, religion, and also a sense of time. And in this poem, T.S. Eliot begins to explore how past, present, and future really merge into a unified sense of time, where past, present, and future are not as distinct as they are in our daily life, perhaps. So here is a portion of T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown, remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree not known, because not looked for, but heard, half heard in the stillness between 2 waves of the sea. T.S. Eliot is sharing with us again this feeling of something flowing, of effluence, of the waves, the sea, the waterfall, the river. And he's capturing what seems to be embedded in our Hebrew text as well, this sense of return having to do with water and flowing. And when we flow, as he says, we get to where we started out, but we know it in a whole new way. We know it for the very first time. There is one more poem I'd like to share with you, having to do with a return and remembering and going back. And that's a song that Joni Mitchell wrote called Woodstock. One of the amazing things about this song that Joni Mitchell wrote is it became really the iconic song seeking to recapture the experience of what it meant to be at the Woodstock Music Festival. What's really astounding about this is that Joni Mitchell was never at the Woodstock Music Festival. What happened was that she was performing a concert in New York City, I believe it was. And then at the end of her concert, a number of the musicians made plans to travel, many by helicopter, out to the Woodstock Festival. And Joni Mitchell and her manager at the time, David Geffen, they were looking at images that were being broadcast about what the concert venue looked like. And it looked frightening. It looked chaotic. There was rain and mud and hundreds of thousands of people and car jams. And David Geffen said to Joni Mitchell, I don't think it's worth the risk to try and get out there. And Joni Mitchell agreed, and she stayed behind. And then she longed for having been there. And so she wrote this song And this song, which was, she performed quite beautifully and was also really momentously performed by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, became the anthem of having been at Woodstock. And of course, as I say, the irony is she was never there. But that is what it means to be a great artist, I think. To use one's imagination to experience something that one personally did not really experience. That's the great talent of an actor. That's the great talent of a writer, of an artist, to be able to feel and experience something that you may not have directly experienced and be able to share that outward with others. So here is from Joni Mitchell's Woodstock. I came upon a child of God. He was walking along the road, and I asked him, where are you going? And this he told me, I'm going on down to Yasgur's farm. I'm going to join in a rock and roll band. I'm going to camp out on the land. I'm going to try and get my soul free. We are stardust. We are golden. And we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. This feeling that Joni Mitchell is conveying, not just about journeying to a place she never was, Woodstock, but also perhaps on a more meta level, this notion about we've got to get ourselves back to the garden is also conveying the notion that we're going back to somewheres that we sense we've been to, but maybe we've never really been there. And to get back to the garden as perhaps someone who's never been there means you're getting back to some place you've never been to, but somehow you sense that it's a point of origin for you nevertheless. So here is our sense of what it means to return. To return, which is what the Jubilee year is all about, is based upon not a replication of what has existed before. It's based upon deror, a release, a flowing. It's not a holding on to something that once existed. It's a letting go of everything that has pre-existed. And when you do that, that's a true return. So with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts, reflections, and what else you encountered along the way of reading this week's Torah portion. If you raise your hand, I'd so love to call upon you. Paul, go ahead and unmute and share with us.
Yeah, the idea of the Jubilee, where it occurs nowadays, where they're talking about student debt, where I was really overwhelmed by the number of people and the amount of money involved in student debt, because so many of these kids, they can't buy a home, they can't do anything. And so the idea of a release, a Jubilee, it came up in Congress, but the number of people just won't do it. But these are people that supposedly very religious, and so they should read this parsha.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you. All right, and others, like Wendy, go ahead. And there's Bill, and you're going to unmute so we can hear you.
There we go.
Yeah.
Actually, I guess my reading of when we just read through this whole Torah portion is, I don't know, maybe I'm too earthbound in many ways, is I find it extremely troubling. And so as we were going through it all at the end, I wrote down kind of some questions for myself to kind of throw out there. As I understand the passage, at least on its face, what they're having happen is, and this 50th year, the year of Jubilee, there's a whole lot of release going on. But the release is also limited in ways that I just wanted to kind of bring up. And so one of the things that struck me is, so what happens to what I will call the stranger, who is now part of the Jewish community, but did not have the historical basis that is certainly referenced, I think, in this portion of Torah, so that he or she has come to buy some portion of land and then has to give it back to the ancestral persons that had that at the 50th year, so that the stranger, since they were not part of the original tribes, if you will, never has any ongoing ownership, if you will, of the land, which I guess in the other side of it is supposed to set forth that we as mere humans can never really own the earth. It's all owned by God. And so it's always on loan. But in this case, the people that get to have any type of ongoing loan are a couple of very distinct insular groups, and nobody ever gets to join them or is part of them ever. So I guess that was one aspect. And then kind of going along with that one, I found myself thinking, so if Mr. X, because if we're looking backwards, it was all the male ownership anyway, it goes into these times of trouble and has debt and kind of quote unquote sells his land, and in your example, only to another Jewish Israeli, if you will, someone in the nation of Israel. I find myself answering, so in one sense, there's no consequence for that person's kind of mismanagement over the course of the previous 50 years or however much it might have been. And then I guess it's my 40 years of practicing real property law. I find myself wondering, and also as the families grow and people are out there, do each one of the holdings get smaller and smaller over generations? Kind of who gets what? I find how all of it would happen to be chaotic at best. And I'm not sure how one ever goes back to kind of giving things back to those. And I guess my final ever thoughts were in the portions that are talking about slavery, and there's certainly, I don't think, intended necessarily to be a ringing endorsement of the concept, but there certainly is a differentiation in the concept, so that if I heard it correctly, the persons who have had their finances devastated to effect where they have become slaves for, as you put it, another Jewish person, they're released on the year of Jubilee. But if I understood and read it correctly, my quote unquote brother in mankind who's not Jewish, they're not. I didn't see that they're being released in the year of Jubilee. It seemed to me that they just continued on. And so I get the positive side of the redemption in Jubilee, but I find the whole thing extremely troubling as to how and why we go about saying, you get it, you don't. And that one completely also ignores the entire other kind of built-in foundation, if you will, of my wife and my daughter. They'll never have anything, okay? I mean, we have the one or two examples of women inheriting through Torah stories, but they are the aberration as it would appear. And so they're still kind of out there. So I don't know, I understand the year of Jubilee being a redemption in a way, but how it is presented and what's going on, I find this one of the most troubling passages in Torah.
Okay, so I appreciate your being provoked and troubled by it. And so here's a couple of thoughts. One is that in terms of how this was actually practiced, probably it wasn't practiced after sometime in the 8th century BCE, because this is a system that was supposed to be practiced only when all the tribes existed in the land. And after the Assyrians attacked and we have the loss of 10 of the tribes in the year 722 BC, something like that, we don't have the capacity even to begin to implement this. So in terms of it actually, and certainly by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, there's no observance of the Jubilee year. So it's more of a utopian vision of the sense of things can get messy in real life. Let's have an opportunity to try and reset them. And in terms of your specific point about someone who's not an Israelite, I'm not sure that this envisions non-Israelites being able to gain possession or ownership of any of this territory. And then the other, I guess, more overriding point I'd like to share is I read Torah text with both a critical eye and a compassionate heart. And so I read some of what is similar to what you're reading, with critical about how could they have done these things and how could they have lived this way. And then this week's Torah portion in particular reminds me to have a compassionate heart, because one of the verses that we read, it shall be a jubilee for a year. You shall call out release in the land for all who live there. That verse was inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. And I believe it was 1770. Well, in 1778, it was rung, the Liberty Bell was rung to proclaim the public reading of the Declaration of Independence. And I'm thinking, this verse, which by then was a couple thousand years old, was inscribed on a bell called the Liberty Bell that was rung to read the United States Declaration of Independence, a country that had slaves. And so I'm trying to have a sense of how well are we doing that we can have this level of critique of a 2,500-year-old text. And of course, we know through Jewish history, as time goes along, not only is slavery forbidden, but some of the debt practices that seem to be quite explicit here get undone by rabbis in the 1st, 2nd century CE, when they realize how complicated it is to be living this way of debts being forgiven, what happens to people who loaned money and that kind of thing. So things get reworked. So I read it as you do, with a critical mind, a critical eye, and a compassionate heart as well. So, and I know you have that as well. So I'm very grateful that you brought up these remarks that allow us to go a little bit deeper into the material. Thank you. And let me call upon Robert and then Anna.
Well, I really appreciate that, the discussion, and a critical eye and compassionate heart is beautiful. There's a poem in there. I don't think it's possible for us to understand the mentality of people 3,500 years ago. And for me, the question is, where does the Pentateuch come from? For me, it comes from God. So the people 3,500 years ago didn't think the way we think. Slavery has been a way of life all over the world, and worse. So we've had to evolve to have the kind of understanding and mindset that we have today. They had no concept of technology like we have. They have no concept of freedom the way we understand it, of civilization and so forth. And so I understand this to be perfect for that time, but we can't see through the eyes of that time, people who lived then. We can see through it, the eyes of people who are far more enlightened, because in those days it was agrarian. I mean, if you look at the art, if you look at poetry, if you look at engineering, if you look at science, mathematics didn't exist. Medicine didn't exist. Algebra didn't exist. So I think that's the challenge. Good-hearted people like you look at this and say, how could they do that? But then we can't imagine, we can't understand, because we can never have that mindset. It's like an eagle trying to understand what it's like to crawl along the ground or maybe be a butterfly. When it's up that high, it can't understand. But there's a reason that butterfly is where it is. It's perfect for that time. So I may be a mixed analogy, but I hope you'll forgive me for it. Wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much, Robert. And Anna.
Well, I was going to take exception with what you said, Rabbi.
Okay.
When you said it might be just a utopian model, but you also gave credence to the fact that it was perhaps actually practiced for 800 years, which is a whole lot of 7-year periods added up, and quite a few 50s also. And I don't think that, I don't think to say it's utopian, it seems sort of dismissive and elitist of people who were living there and being there. But I don't know. I'm just saying it strikes me that way. What I've been thinking about all the way through this, all this week and about this portion is that Shabbat is a long day when you're thinking about other things, or it's too short of a day when you're just absorbed in something wonderful that you're doing, or some study or meditation or prayer. A whole year of Shabbat is a long time. What we haven't even touched on, I think, is what in the world is everyone doing on all the time when they aren't farming and when they aren't, working, or when they aren't dealing with money, or when they aren't doing these other things. That's a long bit of time. Now, there's the transactional stuff of who owes who what, and who's free and who isn't. But there's also how far do we have to travel to get back home? Where were we? And what happens when we come home? It's a for Shabbat or for Rosh Hashanah or a holiday. It's like you get your family around you. You renew relationships. And so if the flowing down from the mountain, where if it's flowing from God, it's the primary basis of the Torah for me is the relationship with God. And that's kind of a personal and intimate thing. And when you get back to your own home and get back to your table, to your family, you have time to renew relationships.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's it.
Thank you. And Richard.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One about Martin Luther King's speech and his death coming after he stood up for the sanitation workers. Because isn't that the big problem now? Of who has to take care of the garbage and what they deserve for that work. And that just occurred to me with him. And then about the garden, when Joni Mitchell says it's time to get back to the garden, and you talked about her, being able to come forth and manifest the feeling, even though she was not there. But I thought was, well, no, she wasn't at the farm, but she understood that all of us have to get our eyes and our values set on the track of the garden. That's the garden. It's not a place, but it's what's in here that we're taking with us. We got to get back to doing that. And that's the freedom, and the liberty is from no longer engaging in this sinful, greedy stuff.
Right. Amen.
Thank you. And lastly, what I initially wrote down was, I thought, well, wait a minute. Every 7 years, you're going to go back to your, not possessions, not ownership, because it ain't yours, it's God's, but your holdings. the original holdings that you and your clan were put in charge of. Okay. And every 7 years, you got to go back there. Well, my question is, where were they in the meantime? Where did they go? Did they go into one of them walled cities without places to plant stuff? So they didn't, while these other guys they rented to or leased to were toiling away during those years. And even when they couldn't sow any crops and had to eat dirty potatoes off the ground. And then they had the opportunity to come back and pay out for the rest of the years and give some of that money back. They didn't give it away. They gave it to the laborers and sent them on their way. And on the one hand, oh yeah, we can say they disrupted them. No, they had money for the crops they didn't sow. But it's also the case, perhaps in this, I don't know if utopian, but the notion that God took this certain group of people and gave them holdings to be responsible for. And so you got to get back there and take that responsibility. You're not going to be a absentee landlord forever. And you can go into the walled city with the coin you get, but you got to go back there. And if you don't, they've rented to own, and then they own it if you don't go back. So I don't know that that's such a bad idea. And I can understand that if you're going to build an economy, you got people that know the land, that are intelligent in managing money and farm equipment and this stuff, and take responsibility for the land as God's right hand in the land. And that's what we expect oligarchs to be, not simply the rich, powerful kingmakers, but actually the educated class or the intelligent class that can manage things. Not everybody can do that. We're all equal before the law to have our cases heard, but it's true that somebody's got to take a dedicated hand to managing the crops and managing the economy. And often that doesn't happen. There's a lot of corruption. And this is a step toward trying to do something about that. And I think Anna's right. There's a lot of 50 years in 800 years. I think there's 40 of them, which is an interesting Jewish number. And that at that time, we're trying to set up some not governance of the land, but some dedication. You can't, for instance, sacrifice a blemished animal because it's disrespectful. And everything you do on this land is out of respect for God. And the only freedom is to get freedom from the Pharaoh that's buried deep inside you.
All right.
So
So
that's what I thought about.
So here's what to bring it to draw to somewhat of a conclusion for tonight. All your references to managing the land and to having to have a sense of the administration of it. Well, one character comes to mind, and that's Joseph. So Joseph had this capacity to be that kind of administrator. He was someone who saw that there'd be 7 years, good years, followed by 7 years of lean years. So we need to manage our produce so that we can survive. And what's remarkable about Joseph as a character is that he was a conflation of a dreamer and an executive administrator, that he was able to overlap these two ideas of, you can call one utopian, full of dreams, and the other hardcore, based in the administration of reality. And Joseph is a character who seemed to be able to overlap the two.
And he brought his family back together.
And he brought his family back together and promised that they would bring him back to a place he had never been. And so I'm looking back at the painting as a way to kind of draw this together. The painting of the Jubilee Year by Yoram Ra'anan. He could have done a painting that looked like the land, the promised land, the land of Israel, and divided among as it would be apportioned among the 12 tribes. he could have painted something that showed perfection according to this scheme of all the land being divided up among the 12 tribes. Instead, what he paints is something that's much more impressionistic, if you will. It is something that is evocative, and the highlights of it, or what he focuses on, are the musical notes coming out of the shofarot, out of the shofars, these golden notes coming out of the shofars. That to him is what he wanted to focus on, it seems to me, in his painting. And the musical notes are a source of awakening, a reminder, a convocation, a reassembly, in order to, as you put it, refocus out of the chaos, to refocus the chaos that we have wrought through our imperfect lives and living, to refocus on what this is supposed to be all about. And whether or not it is really about the specifics of the land and the debts and everything, or whether that is all metaphoric for something else, about refocusing on those instructions and paths that are designed to sanctify life as opposed to profaning life. That seems to me to be what's happening in his painting. Those golden notes are a convocation, calling us back together, back to the garden, to make it again as beautiful, make this world as beautiful as God intended for us to be able to make it. So with that, I want to thank each and everyone for coming together, for your thoughts, your comments, your both your discomfort as well as your comfort, your provocations, as well as your convocations, and all of that helps make an enrichment that's a great source of blessing for us all. Thank you all very much. Look
Thank
forward
you.
to our regathering. Be well,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank
God
you,
bless.
Rabbi.
Be well.
Thank you very much. See you next week.